Hi, everybody. Welcome to another version of the Bruce Singer podcast. So I want to share what this podcast is all about. One, it's focused on a specific area, which is food and agriculture right across the board. And we're not about selling. We're all about providing value, providing inspiration, storytelling, things that you can use and apply right away in your business to be more successful. And today we've got a great guest, which is Brett Wills. I'll tell you about Brett in a moment. Thank you for coming on the podcast. And again, I'm Bruce, and I am the host, and I'm also the CEO and founder of Canada CFOs, which provides fractional CFOs and helps them raise capital, again, to the same sector, the food and ag sector, food tech, agri-tech, right across the board. So we're very proud, and this is a passion thing we do, which is podcasts, and it's all great and super. So we got Brett Wills. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here, Bruce.
Awesome. So I'm going to tell you a bit about Brett. Brett is the founder and CEO of CarbonOne, and he will tell you more about what CarbonOne does. And one of the reasons I had him on the podcast, it's all about food. It's all about food, beverage, and agriculture. That's what he does. This is his area. So you're going to get a ton of value today. I can guarantee it. Things that really he'll share with you. He's been in the field of sustainability for 25 years. He's authored 2 books on this subject as well. If you notice, he's got them right behind him, right on his desk. He's got them right there. And he's also been a professor, again, focusing on business sustainability management and also accounting, carbon accounting as well. Am I correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Carbon, and we'll talk more. So right in the wheelhouse. And so we're going to talk. We'll jump right into it. So, Brett, tell us about CarbonOne. What's the story?
Yeah. So, CarbonOne is, I think first and foremost, we're a purpose-driven organization. Our purpose is fighting climate change to feed the world. There's obviously a very clear connection between, climate change and the agricultural industry. And we believe by fighting climate change, we can address food insecurity and help feed the world and help Canada feed the world. So we're a clean tech, Canadian clean tech company operating in the carbon accounting and reporting space, specifically for food and beverage companies here in Canada. We're led by a founder team with over 6 decades of experience in sustainability and the agri-food sector. And what we have done, Bruce, is we've solved a very specific and real problem for Canadian food and beverage companies. And that's making it simple and affordable to measure, improve, and communicate carbon emissions, specifically the carbon footprint of food and beverage products. And our solution reduces both the cost and time of doing that by over 90%. And it's super easy for any brand to use. You don't need any previous knowledge or experience. You simply sign up, enter information, walk through our process, and off you go.
Okay, we're going to come back to some specifics, but thank you for sharing. So I want to take go off to the side a moment. I'd love to hear your story. Okay?
Yeah.
Look, when we were kids, there was no such thing as this at 25 years. I mean, this is all. I mean, there was, but you know how it is. So how did you get to where you? How did you get into this? Starting at the beginning. Run with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sometimes I ask myself that question, Bruce. How did I get here? But when I look back on things, it's I don't know if it was by design or surprise or it just happened that way, but it seems the stars aligned. I mean, I grew up in a very small town in Niagara region, Port Colborne, Ontario, and I had an appetite for things bigger. Went off to university at Wilfrid Laurier, and I was always really passionate and interested in the outdoors and the environment. Loved the canoeing and hiking, and I was a ski instructor for 10 years through university. And actually, I started my first job out of university with a company called Powersmiths, the world's leading designer and manufacturer of energy efficient transformers. I started out with them as the environmental programs coordinator, getting products certified under Energy Star and Eco Logo. and worked my way up in that organization to eventually take over as the plant manager, responsible for all manufacturing operations and the P&L on that side of the business. And I was tasked with a project to drive sustainability performance. And this was, decades ago almost now, when no one was really talking about this sustainability stuff. And what I had found was, after I harvested some of the low-hanging fruit, I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know how to keep the company moving forward. So I looked for a process that I could follow, and I couldn't find anything. And at the time, I was doing a lot of the lean manufacturing stuff, Six Sigma, those types of things. And I said, wouldn't it be great if we had a process like this for driving environmental performance? And we didn't, and there wasn't. So I developed one myself. And it's called the Lean and Green process. So it's based upon lean thinking. Instead of looking at the 7 lean wastes from the perspective of the customer's viewpoint at waste, it looks at our operations and our value stream from the perspective of the environment and what the environment views as waste. Identified 7 green wastes instead of the 7 lean wastes, and ended up documenting that process, implementing it at Powersmiths. It worked beautifully. My suppliers started asking me if I can help them. I ended up turning my process into my first book, Green Intentions. And from there, I started to get asked to speak at all kinds of conferences. And I made a decision in 2008, right when the world was going into the greatest recession since the Depression, that I was going to quit my well-paying job, and I was going to start a consulting firm on sustainability. And everyone asked me, first of all, are you crazy to quit your job and do this? And the second question is, what is sustainability? Yeah. Right. And I took the leap of faith, and I started the Green Enterprise Movement, which is a sustainable business management consulting firm. And for 15 years, I grew that company year over year, and had the opportunity to work with over 500 companies across North America, in most of them in the food and beverage industry. So about 75–80% of the companies I was working with was food and beverage. Then I got to sort of a point in my consulting career where I didn't feel like I was having the impact that I wanted to have, and decided to look at opportunities for having a bigger impact. I connected with a few people who are now co-founders of CarbonOne, and we launched CarbonOne, to solve that very specific problem for food and beverage companies. Bruce, we saw something coming down the pipe, right? Carbon accounting and reporting, and we knew that, food and beverage companies, 90% of which are small companies, right? It's dominated by the small companies here in Canada, and they just wouldn't, have the capacity or the resources to tackle this with existing solutions. And that's how I sort of ended up where I am today.
Interesting. So basically, you were ahead of your time.
Yeah. Yes.
You're way ahead of your time. It's
people always tell me that, right? And they keep telling me that now, right? Even with CarbonOne, but I've always been a fan of getting ahead of the curve, right? So
I love it. I love it. Okay, so you mentioned problems. Okay, and we had a chat before. We talked about certain things. We had a bit of a chat. So problem number. Let's talk about some of these particular buckets, if you want to call it, of issues or concerns or problems. The first one, tell me about regulation, let's say. You know what I mean?
So, there's mounting pressure on food and beverage companies, and really all companies, to report carbon emissions. And, what we're seeing right now.
That's public companies? Public companies?
Yeah, so public companies, but it'll trickle down. It'll trickle down across the entire value chain here. So we're living through a paradigm shift right now, Bruce, where the world is shifting towards mandated and regulated reporting for carbon emissions. So like most things sustainability, it starts over in Europe. And there's regulations in Europe right now, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, for example. that mandates, emissions reporting for not only publicly traded, but large companies and even some smaller companies. Yesterday, we had a momentous decision through the Securities and Exchange Commission where they're going to now start to require mandatory reporting of carbon emissions for publicly traded companies. It was a little bit watered down, but nonetheless, it's a start. And then here in Canada, Bruce, next week, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board is going to be issuing a draft of the first draft of the regulations for companies here in Canada, which will require all publicly traded companies in Canada to report carbon emissions along with their annual financial filings. And what this means for companies in the food industry is, even if you're not a large or publicly traded company here in Canada, because the reporting requirements will, if not immediately, certainly in the near future, require what's called Scope 3 emissions. So when you're reporting carbon emissions, it's split into 3 scopes. Scope 1 is direct emissions from natural gas used in the facility, any fuels, things like that, refrigerants. Scope 2 is indirect emissions purely from purchased electricity that's used in the facility. And then Scope 3 is all the other emissions. So that's the emissions from across the entire value chain, from growing the ingredients on the farm all the way through to the end of the life of those products. And because most of and pretty much all the retailers are publicly traded, you have some major publicly traded food companies here in Canada. For any company that's feeding into any of the retailers, because it includes Scope 3 and they have to report Scope 3, they have to report the carbon emissions of each product that they're selling to a retailer. So whether it's Loblaw or Sobeys or Metro or wherever it'll be. So by default, you will have to, even if you're a small company, you will have to report the carbon emissions of products being sold to your retail customers and any of the big, other public listed companies. So even though it's not targeted at the small companies, just the way it works with that Scope 3 stuff, by default, you're going to
you can't get out of it. You can't get out of it.
You can't get out of it.
And let me ask you a question. So if I'm a manufacturer and I'm selling to one of the big retailers, and as a manufacturer, I got suppliers, I have ingredient suppliers, I got packaging suppliers. Yeah, now I got to go back to them and get there. Is that how this thing's going to work? Right.
That's how it's going to work.
It goes right down to it could be in Saskatchewan who made the wheat. I'm just whatever, I'm just whoever. Yeah. Let's say you're in plant-based protein and it's lentils. It goes right back to the beginning. So everybody has to get with the program. Is that kind of how it's going to work?
Correct. So, let's say I'm a food and beverage manufacturer, and I'm making, a loaf of bread, or I'm making a plant-based, CPG product. What I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to take my list of ingredients and packaging materials. So let's say I'm getting, wheat as one of my ingredients. I'm going to have to understand the carbon emissions that are generated from growing that wheat on the farm, shipping that wheat to a flour mill, sending that to their supplier, whether it's a Gordon Food Service or whoever that supplier may be.
Everybody involved.
Shipping that to my facility, allocating a portion of my Scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions to one unit of product, and then shipping that out to my customer. So you're going to have to understand all of that and be able to calculate the emissions of not only every ingredient, but also the emissions of your packaging materials, and do it in a way that meets all of the carbon accounting standards. So there is the same level of rigor in carbon accounting that there is in financial accounting. So you don't just do it any way that you want. You have to follow certain standards and protocols. What becomes the big challenge for food and beverage companies is the data, right? What's the carbon emissions of wheat grown in Saskatchewan? And the carbon emissions of wheat grown in Saskatchewan is going to be different than wheat grown in Alberta or wheat grown somewhere in Europe. So they all have different data points. And that's where we really help out. We provide those data points. We provide the methodology and the calculation. So all you have to do is, enter where you're getting your wheat from and how much, right?
So
Yeah, it goes all the way
you're
through
taking
the value chain.
hopefully you're taking the overwhelm out of it. Because I started feeling overwhelmed just by hearing it.
Yeah,
Now,
so
if I'm a manufacturer at the end of the value chain, like just before the retailer, I could see myself feeling overwhelmed. But you're, and we're not selling anything here, by the way, everybody
Yeah.
listening. We're just trying to understand. Your product would solve that issue. Am I right?
it makes it easy for any brand to do.
So as a manufacturer, I might once someone along my value chain, let's say my ingredient person, my ingredient company might not be able to give me the information. I put my company is now at risk.
Yeah, it's a
Get it?
risk.
Okay, I got it.
It's
now.
also an opportunity, though.
It's an opportunity, but I want to understand. I
Yeah.
understand. But this has been this is an eye opener. Because people think, oh, I got my packaging, I'm good, man. It's not just you. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
you and and everybody in your food value chain.
Correct.
So let's talk. Okay, I got it. So this regulation, when is this coming? When is this coming? This regulation. What's the date?
Yeah, so here in Canada, the first draft of the regulations are being put out for public consultation next week. So the week of what is it, March 11th. They're going to come out. I don't know if they're coming out on Monday or the Friday. We don't know yet. And then it'll go through a consultation period. Our understanding as it stands right now is they want to have the final regulations ready to go by January of 2025. That can be used for the 2024 reporting year.
I got it. Okay. So there's some other things other hot issues we don't talk about. One of them I think is a few. One of them is net zero. What can you share on that?
Yeah, so net zero.
All I know is net zero and STG goals. That's my know. I mean a little more than that, but I'm talking. Right. Can you expand on that? Yeah.
Yeah, so the SDGs is 17 global goals that essentially is the blueprint for peace and prosperity across the world, and net zero is just one little piece that aligns with those SDGs, right? So net zero is a commitment to reduce carbon emissions that are in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius, target under the Paris Accord, and basically what it sets out is a pathway for companies to follow to get to a dramatic reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. So you have to set what are called near-term targets that are going to require a specific reduction by 2030. In the food industry, it's approximately 30%, including scope 3, and about 72% by 2050. Now you have to reach those reduction targets through real actual reductions, and you can only use carbon credits or carbon offsets to get you the remainder of the way after you achieve those long-term targets, what is called the residual emissions. So what companies need to know is that they're not going to buy their way out of net zero. You have to realize real reductions in both the near term by 2030 and the longer term by 2050. Now, it's important to note this, Bruce, that 90% of global GDP is covered by a net zero commitment, including Canada's largest grocery retailers. Companies like Loblaws and Metros and Sobeys, they all have net zero targets. That includes scope 3. So even if you're a small company or a company that does not have a net zero target or commitment, If you are feeding into the retailers, again, by default, you
You're
will
part of it.
have that commitment, and you will have to show progress towards those net zero targets over time.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, and by the way, we talked about this before the podcast, so he explained a bit to me. I just want to share with everybody the greenwashing.
Yeah.
What is? It seems kind of sexy, the name.
Yeah.
Okay, greenwashing.
Yeah,
What
just
is?
very quickly, greenwashing is the over embellishment of the environmental performance of a company or the environmental attributes of a product, right? So it's making a claim on the environmental attributes of a product without being able to back that up or in a misleading manner. It's been something that's been happening for years. The EU just in January introduced some greenwashing regulations where you're not going to be able to make any environmental claims without the science-based evidence
Okay,
to back that up.
I
And
got
we're
it now.
starting to see that here in Canada. So, basically that's another pressure point that you're going to have to be measuring. If you want to make a climate claim, right, you're going to have to be able to back that up with science-based evidence. What's known in the sustainability industry as a life cycle assessment, where you look at the carbon emissions across the entire life cycle of a product.
So basically, as we progress in this paradigm shift, you got to get, everybody's got to get with the program.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just no way. You can't just go ahead and say we're good. You know what I mean?
Not
You
anymore.
can't just go ahead and say I'm good, I'm good, I'm good. And the ultimate risk is basically like we said earlier, you get delisted.
Yeah, I think, there's different risks for the different things, right? So I think that, if you're not reporting, to retailers, or you're not, progressing on net zero targets, there's certainly a potential risk for, getting delisted, losing market share. On the greenwashing stuff though, Bruce, it gets a little bit dicier because we're actually seeing cases in the courts right now, both in the US, Canada, and certainly in Europe, where companies are being taken to court for greenwashing.
I got it. I got it. Okay, so let me tell you my take. I get it, and I'm here sitting. I'm feeling overwhelmed. Boy, I got it. I'm putting myself in my client's shoes. I got issues with inflation. I got to worry about this. Now there's another thing I got to worry about, and more costs.
Yeah.
Is this the way? I'd love to hear I love your insights on this, because that's how I start to feel. You know what I mean? And I know we're going with this. I know you have. What can final word? Yeah.
I agree. It can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
What I would say to food and beverage companies is this. It's a risk, but it's also an opportunity. Environmental impact, carbon emissions is just another form of waste. So anytime you can drive waste out of the organization, you're going to realize cost savings. The second thing is that, companies who can get ahead of this, they're going to be able to differentiate themselves. They're going to be able to provide a unique selling proposition on how they can help, larger companies or their customers, achieve their net zero targets, for example. Third, Bruce, is in response to all this, technology is catching up, right? And we're one of the players in that field. And with the advancements in technology, right? What it's doing is it's simplifying it, it's reducing the cost, and it's making, it's reducing those barriers to entry. So if there's good news, I would say that's certainly a piece of good news, is that, there's technology emerging to address this challenge and to help reduce the burden on these small companies.
Well, something over time, like anything, will become second nature.
It will
eventually become second. It's a new thing. But, and also another message is, I got plenty of time. I got years to do this stuff. That is like you said, you can really differentiate yourself, and there's money to be saved.
Yeah, there's money to be saved.
You're forced into it, but in a way, it might be a good forcing. When it's all said and done, it might be. This has been very, very insightful. I learned a lot. what I learned is call the expert. Okay. Call the expert.
Yeah,
Because yeah, it's just a lot to do. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Last
my
final
pleasure.
words. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we say goodbye to the audience? Anything else
You
I
know,
did
the
ask
only
if you want to share? Final
yeah,
words. Yeah.
the only thing I want to say, Bruce, is, I think that a lot of companies in the food and beverage sector get beat up these days. And what I want to say is, I want to say thank you to all those food and beverage companies out there that work so hard every single day
Yeah.
to make sure that there's food on our tables. And we can't thank them enough. And they don't get enough credit for what they do. They're
It's so true
thank you.
because we
Yeah,
take it for granted. And other countries, the food security, food hunger, it's a growing problem. It's a very serious problem. And
it is.
and it's a problem in Canada, but for the majority part, I look across the street and I got a massive supermarket right there, man. I'm hungry. I got a 1 minute walk. I get all the food I want.
That's right. And a lot of people don't realize that, Canadian food and beverage companies are not only feeding Canadians, but they're feeding the rest of the world. And, that's something that Canadians should be very proud of.
I think that's wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you.
Everybody, thank you so much. Thank you, Brett. And
Thanks, Bruce. Pleasure to be here.
we'll get you next time. Bye-bye.